Hello there, Steve here. Welcome back to another Sleepy Steve story. I hope you are tucked in, comfortable, and warm. Go on, adjust your pillow if you need to, let your shoulders drop, and allow the day to slow down around you because there is absolutely no rush tonight, none at all. Before we drift off tonight, remember to subscribe to help Steve-O out. And I will keep making more sleepy stories to help you study gently, revise quietly, and settle your mind at the end of the day. We are continuing with VCE Psychology, Unit 3, Area of Study 1, and tonight we are looking at coping with stress. In our last sleepy revision story, we looked at stress as a psychobiological process, which means we explored stress as something that involves both the body and the mind, including stressors, stress responses, the fight-flight-freeze response, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, adrenaline, cortisol, the brain, the gut-brain axis, and the biopsychosocial approach. Tonight, we are going to take the next step and look at how people cope with stress, how they appraise stressful situations, how different coping strategies may be more or less effective depending on the context, and how coping is not simply about being strong or calm, but about matching a response to the demands of the situation. We will move slowly through Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping, including primary appraisal, secondary appraisal, and reappraisal. Then we will look at coping strategies, including approach strategies and avoidance strategies, before thinking about coping flexibility, social support, and the idea that effective coping depends on both the person and the situation. You do not need to memorize all of this right now. You do not need to write anything down. Just let the ideas drift in, one after another, and allow your mind to notice the shape of the content, almost as though you are looking at a calm map spread out beneath a warm lamp. Let's take a slow breath in together, right down into the belly, and let it go slowly. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm. Imagine that we are sitting in a peaceful study late in the evening, with rain tapping gently against the window, a soft lamp glowing beside a notebook, and the rest of the house becoming still. Outside, the world is dark and quiet, but inside, there is warmth, space, and time. And tonight, we are simply going to think gently about how human beings respond when life places demands upon them. Stress, as we have already explored, is not always one simple thing. A stressor is a stimulus or event that causes stress, and it may be physical, psychological, social, expected, unexpected, minor, major, acute, or ongoing. But the stress response itself is not only determined by the event. Two people can experience the same situation and respond quite differently, because stress depends not only on what happens, but on how the person interprets what is happening, what resources they believe they have, what support is available, and what choices they can make. This is where Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model becomes useful. The word transactional is important because the model views stress as an ongoing transaction between the person and the environment. It is not just the outside event. It is not just the person's personality. It is the interaction between the demands of the situation and the person's appraisal of their ability to cope with those demands. So, in a very calm way, we can think of stress as a conversation between the world and the mind. The world presents a demand, and the mind asks, "What does this mean for me, and can I manage it?" The first important process in the model is primary appraisal. Primary appraisal is the person's initial evaluation of the significance of a situation, and during primary appraisal, the person is asking whether the situation is irrelevant, benign positive, or stressful. If the situation is irrelevant, it does not matter much for the person's well-being, and therefore it is unlikely to produce a strong stress response. If the situation is benign positive, it may be seen as pleasant, helpful, beneficial, or potentially good. But if the situation is appraised as stressful, the person may see it as involving harm or loss, threat or challenge. Let's slow that down. Harm or loss means that some damage has already occurred, such as failing a test, losing something important, being injured, or having a relationship damaged. Threat means that harm may occur in the future, even if it has not happened yet, such as worrying about an upcoming exam, fearing an argument, or anticipating that something difficult may happen. Challenge means that the situation is demanding, but may also provide an opportunity for growth, learning, achievement, or mastery. This distinction matters because the way a person appraises a situation can influence the emotions they experience, the level of stress they feel, and the coping strategies they are likely to use. An exam, for example, might be appraised by one student as a threat because they feel unprepared and worry about failure, while another student might appraise it as a challenge because they feel nervous but also see it as a chance to show what they know. The same event. Different appraisal. Different stress experience. Take another gentle breath in and slowly let it out. After primary appraisal comes secondary appraisal. Secondary appraisal is the person's evaluation of their coping options and resources, and during secondary appraisal, the person is asking, what can I do? What resources do I have? And do I have enough support, time, knowledge, energy, or control to manage this situation? The person might consider internal resources such as confidence, skills, memory, motivation, emotional regulation, or problem-solving ability. They might also consider external resources such as help from friends, family, teachers, doctors, counselors, information, money, time, or access to services. If the person believes they have enough resources to cope with the demands, the situation may feel more manageable. If the person believes the demands are greater than their resources, the situation may feel more stressful. In this way, secondary appraisal helps explain why stress is not only about the event itself, because a person's perceived coping resources can change the intensity of the stress response. Imagine, for example, that you have an assessment tomorrow. If you believe you have studied, understand the content, know the format, and can ask for help if needed, the assessment may still matter, but it may feel manageable. If you believe you do not understand the content, have no time, cannot access support, and do not know what will be assessed, the same assessment may feel much more threatening. Again, the event matters, but the appraisal also matters. Lazarus and Folkman also describe reappraisal, which is the ongoing process of changing or updating an appraisal as new information becomes available. A person might initially see a situation as threatening, then later realize they have more support than they thought and begin to appraise it as more manageable. Or a person might initially see a situation as manageable, then new demands appear, and the situation becomes more stressful. So appraisal is not a single fixed moment. It can shift. It can be updated. It can change as the person learns more, receives support, gains skills, or experiences new challenges. This is one reason why coping is a process rather than a single action. Now, as the rain continues softly against the window in our quiet study, let's move from appraisal to coping. Coping refers to the efforts a person makes to manage the demands of a stressful situation, and these efforts may be cognitive, behavioral, emotional, social, or practical. Coping is not always about removing the stressor completely. Sometimes the stressor cannot be removed. Sometimes coping means reducing emotional distress. Sometimes it means solving a practical problem. Sometimes it means seeking support. Sometimes it means changing the way the situation is interpreted. And sometimes it means accepting that the situation is difficult while still choosing a helpful next step. One useful way to understand coping is to distinguish between approach coping strategies and avoidance coping strategies. Approach coping involves efforts to directly deal with the stressor or the emotional response to the stressor, rather than turning away from it. An approach strategy might include seeking information, asking for help, making a study plan, discussing the problem with someone trustworthy, practicing a skill, using relaxation techniques, or taking direct action to change the situation. Approach coping is often helpful when the person has some control over the stressor, because direct action can reduce the demands of the situation or increase the person's resources. For example, if a student is stressed about a SAC because they are unsure about a topic, an approach strategy might be to review the relevant content, ask the teacher a specific question, complete practice questions, and organize time to revise. The stressor has not disappeared immediately, but the student is moving towards it in a planned and constructive way. Avoidance coping involves efforts to evade, deny, minimize, or distract from the stressor or the emotional response to it. Avoidance strategies might include procrastinating, pretending the problem does not exist, avoiding reminders of the issue, distracting oneself for long periods, or refusing to seek help. Avoidance coping is often less effective when the stressor needs to be addressed, because the problem may remain or become larger over time. However, it is important to be careful here, because not every form of temporary distraction is harmful. Sometimes taking a short break, going for a walk, breathing slowly, listening to calming music, or stepping away from a stressful situation briefly can help a person regulate emotion before returning to the problem. So in VCE psychology, we want to avoid overly simple statements like approach coping is always good and avoidance coping is always bad. A better answer is that coping strategies must be evaluated in context. A strategy is more likely to be effective when it matches the demands of the situation, the level of control the person has, the person's resources, and the likely consequences of using that strategy. This brings us to coping flexibility. Coping flexibility is the ability to adjust coping strategies to suit the demands of different stressful situations. It means that a person does not use the same coping strategy in every situation, but instead considers what is needed and changes their response when the situation changes. A flexible coper might use problem-focused action when they can change the source of stress, emotional regulation when they need to calm their body and mind, social support when they need connection or practical help, and acceptance when the situation cannot be changed immediately. Coping flexibility is useful because stressors are different. Some stressors are controllable, some are not. Some are short-term, some are ongoing, some require action, some require patience, some require support, some require a change in thinking. If a person uses only one strategy, even a generally helpful one, it may not fit every situation. For example, making a detailed plan may be very useful when a student can control their revision time, but less useful when coping with the sudden illness of a family member, where emotional support and flexibility may be more important. On the other hand, avoiding a problem may reduce distress in the very short term, but if the problem needs action, avoidance may increase stress later. So, as a calm memory anchor, you might remember this. Effective coping is not just about choosing a good strategy. It is about choosing a strategy that fits. Let's breathe slowly again, in and out. Now let's think about coping strategies in a little more detail. Problem-focused coping is a type of coping that aims to change or manage the source of stress. It may involve planning, problem-solving, time management, seeking information, developing skills, or taking practical steps to reduce the stressor. This can be effective when the person has some control over the situation. For example, if a person is stressed because they have multiple tasks due, problem-focused coping might involve making a realistic schedule, breaking the tasks into smaller parts, speaking with a teacher about priorities, and beginning with the most manageable step. Emotion-focused coping is a type of coping that aims to manage the emotional response to the stressor. It may involve relaxation, breathing, mindfulness, reframing thoughts, expressing emotions, seeking emotional support, or using strategies that reduce physiological arousal. This can be effective when the person has limited control over the stressor, or when their emotional response is making it difficult to think clearly. For example, if a person is waiting for medical results, they may not be able to change the timing of the results, but they can use emotion-focused strategies to manage worry while they wait. Social support is another important coping resource. Social support can be emotional, such as comfort, empathy, reassurance, and being listened to. It can be informational, such as advice, guidance, explanation, or feedback. It can be instrumental, such as practical help with transport, tasks, money, or resources, and it can involve companionship, where simply spending time with others helps a person feel less alone. Social support can help reduce stress because it may increase the person's perceived resources during secondary appraisal. A person who feels supported may appraise a stressful situation as more manageable than a person who feels isolated. Support can also provide practical solutions, emotional regulation, new perspectives, and a sense of belonging. However, social support must also fit the person and the situation. Unwanted advice may not always help. Support that is judgmental may increase stress. Support that encourages avoidance may not be useful when action is needed. So again, context matters. The quiet rain outside the window reminds us that stress can be gentle or heavy, brief or long, predictable or sudden, and coping must often be just as varied. Now, let's connect coping back to the biopsychosocial approach, because in VCE psychology, stress and coping are rarely considered from only one angle. Biological factors may affect coping because a person's nervous system, hormones, sleep, physical health, genetic predispositions, and level of physiological arousal can influence how they respond to stress. For example, Chronic sleep loss may make it harder to regulate emotion and think clearly, which may reduce the person's ability to use effective coping strategies. Psychological factors may affect coping because thoughts, beliefs, memory, personality, emotional regulation, self-efficacy, resilience, coping history, and appraisal can influence the way a person understands and responds to stress. For example, a person with strong self-efficacy may be more likely to believe that they can manage a challenge, which may influence secondary appraisal and encourage approach coping. Social factors may affect coping because family support, peer relationships, cultural expectations, school or workplace demands, financial resources, community connection, and access to services can influence both the demands placed on the person and the resources available to them. For example, a student with supportive teachers and a calm home environment may have more resources for coping with academic stress than a student facing isolation or instability. The biopsychosocial approach reminds us that coping is not simply a matter of willpower. It is shaped by the body, the mind, and the social world. This is especially important when evaluating the effectiveness of coping strategies, because a strategy that seems simple on paper may be difficult to use if the person lacks resources, support, time, safety, sleep, or confidence. Now, as you settle a little deeper, let's return to Lazarus and Folkman and link the model together. A person encounters a potential stressor. They make a primary appraisal, asking whether the situation is irrelevant, benign positive, or stressful. If it is stressful, they may appraise it as harm or loss, threat or challenge. Then they make a secondary appraisal, asking what resources and coping options are available. They choose coping strategies, which may be approach or avoidance, problem-focused or emotion-focused, supported by internal and external resources. Then, as the situation changes, they may reappraise the situation and adjust their coping. This process is ongoing. It moves, it shifts, it changes with information, resources, emotions, and experience. If you need a simple image for the model, imagine a quiet pathway with several signposts. The first sign asks, "What is happening?" The second sign asks, "What does it mean for me?" The third sign asks, "What can I do?" The fourth sign asks, "Is my strategy working?" And the final sign quietly reminds you that coping can change as the path changes. This is a good way to remember reappraisal. Now let's make it a little more exam-focused, still gently, still slowly. If you are asked to explain how a person copes with stress using Lazarus and Folkman's model, you should include appraisal and coping. You might say that the person first makes a primary appraisal of the situation, deciding whether it is irrelevant, benign positive, or stressful, and if it is stressful, whether it involves harm or loss, threat or challenge. Then the person makes a secondary appraisal, evaluating their coping options and resources, such as knowledge, time, skills, support, and perceived control. Based on these appraisals, the person may use coping strategies to manage the demands of the situation, and as new information becomes available, they may reappraise the situation and adjust their response. If you are asked to evaluate a coping strategy, try not to simply say that it is good or bad. Ask whether it matches the stressor. Ask whether the person has control over the situation. Ask whether it helps in the short term, the long term, or both. Ask whether it reduces physiological arousal, improves problem solving, increases support, or avoids the issue in a way that may create more stress later. That kind of thinking helps make the answer more precise. Let's take another soft breath, in and out. There is one more idea worth resting with tonight. Coping does not mean that stress disappears. Sometimes coping means reducing the intensity of the stress response. Sometimes it means changing what can be changed. Sometimes it means accepting what cannot be changed for now. Sometimes it means asking for help. Sometimes it means taking one small action instead of trying to solve everything at once. And in psychology, coping is studied not as a moral judgment, but as a process that can be analyzed, evaluated, strengthened, and understood. That is a gentle but important idea. The person and the environment interact. The mind appraises, the body responds, the person copes, the situation changes, and the appraisal may begin again. Now, as tonight's revision begins to come to a close, you do not need to hold every detail tightly. Let's simply walk back through the key ideas one more time, slowly and quietly. Stress can be understood as a psychobiological process involving both psychological and biological responses. Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model sees stress as a transaction between the person and the environment. Primary appraisal involves evaluating the significance of the situation and deciding whether it is irrelevant, benign, positive, or stressful. If the situation is stressful, it may be appraised as harm or loss, threat or challenge. Secondary appraisal involves evaluating coping options and resources. Reappraisal involves updating the appraisal as new information becomes available. Coping refers to efforts to manage the demands of a stressful situation. Approach coping moves towards the stressor or the emotional response in a direct and active way. Avoidance coping moves away from the stressor or emotional response and may be useful briefly in some contexts, but may become unhelpful if it prevents necessary action. Problem-focused coping aims to change or manage the source of stress. Emotion-focused coping aims to manage the emotional response to the stressor. Social support can provide emotional, informational, instrumental, and companionship support. Coping flexibility is the ability to adapt coping strategies to fit the demands of different situations. And the effectiveness of coping depends on context, including control, resources, support, timing, and the nature of the stressor. You do not need to hold on to the details now. They can rest quietly in your mind, like notes placed neatly inside a folder, like rain settling into the garden, like a lamp glowing softly beside a closed book. Your studying is done for tonight. You have done enough. Let the nervous system slow. Let the breath soften. Let the body know that it is safe to rest. This has been Sleepy Steve, helping you fall asleep and study. Good night.